What if weakness was not what it seemed? What if the trembling voice, the bowed head, and the tears in the corner of the eye were not signs of helplessness, but signals of a hidden power? And what if those who appear powerless are in fact playing the most sophisticated game of control, not by force, but by evoking your guilt, your pity, and your sense of obligation? The modern world often disguises power. We imagine power as armies marching, as CEOs sitting on thrones of glass and steel, or as charismatic leaders bending crowds to their will. But there is another form of power, quieter, subtler, and far more insidious. It is the power of victimhood, and it thrives because it is rarely recognized for what it truly is. Nietzsche called it ressentiment, the bitter alchemy by which weakness transforms itself into moral superiority. He warned that those who cannot conquer through strength will often conquer through grievance. By presenting themselves as injured, oppressed, or endlessly misunderstood, they weaponize sympathy. They bind the conscience of others. They turn tears into chains. We see this everywhere. In personal relationships where one partner perpetually claims to be wounded in order to manipulate the other. In politics where leaders stoke historical grievances to consolidate authority. And even in culture where entire identities can be fashioned not around creativity or resilience, but around permanent fragility. The victim becomes untouchable, immune to criticism, because any challenge is framed as cruelty. Thus the weak begin to rule, not by strength of arms, but by strength of wounds. Carl Jung once said that the shadow, the part of ourselves we hide, often contains not only our darkest impulses, but also our hidden will to power. The victim mentality hides such a shadow. Behind the mask of fragility may live envy, aggression, or the thirst to dominate, impulses never confessed, but expressed indirectly. Freud saw this too, noting that repressed desires often return in disguised forms. And what disguise is more untouchable than that of the wounded soul? To see this clearly, we must look back to the ancients. Marcus Aurelius in his Meditations reminded himself not to become a Caesar puffed up with power, but he also warned against allowing misfortune to make one bitter and manipulative. If it is endurable, he wrote, then endure it. Stop complaining. The Stoics saw what modern psychology confirms. Complaint can be addictive, and addiction to victimhood becomes a strategy of survival. But there is a danger. When victimhood becomes weaponized, societies bend under its pressure. History is littered with examples. The French Revolution began with legitimate grievances, but quickly spiraled into a reign of terror, where the once oppressed wielded moral outrage as a blade sharper than any guillotine. In our own time, movements meant to bring healing sometimes calcify into endless cycles of blame, where to disagree is to be branded a villain. Here lies the paradox. True suffering is real, and it demands compassion. Yet the performance of suffering, the theatrics of perpetual victimhood, can be just as real and just as destructive. It is here that philosophy and psychology must work together, for only by understanding the mechanics of the victim mentality, its archetypes, its hidden drives, its cultural masks, can we free ourselves from its grip. This series will not dismiss suffering. Instead, it will expose how suffering can be twisted into a tool of domination. We will uncover how weakness is sometimes a disguise, how fragility can cloak aggression, and how entire systems of power are built upon the art of victimhood. So I ask you to look deeper, not only into the world around you, but also into yourself. Have you ever used your pain as leverage? Have you ever witnessed others doing so? And what happens to a society when victimhood becomes its highest currency? This is where we begin. At the crossroads of pity and power, of weakness and control. Welcome to the hidden psychology of victimhood. To understand how weakness becomes a weapon, we must first step inside the mind of the victim. not the one who suffers in silence, but the one who cultivates suffering as an identity. Psychology offers us a map. In cognitive behavioral theory, there are distortions, ways the mind bends reality to preserve its narrative. Among them, catastrophizing, everything is against me, personalization, everyone targets me, and global labeling, I am always the victim. These distortions build a fortress around the victim's self-concept. To question them feels like cruelty. To oppose them feels like oppression. And so the victim's worldview becomes untouchable, because it is woven with the sacred thread of suffering. Martin Seligman, in his experiments on learned helplessness, showed how dogs exposed to inescapable shocks eventually stopped trying to escape, even when freedom was possible. Humans behave the same way. When suffering is repeated, when control seems absent, some learn helplessness. But here lies the twist. Helplessness, once internalized, can become a social strategy. By declaring, I cannot, one extracts help, protection, and attention. By declaring, I am powerless, one draws others into responsibility. Jung would have called this a dance with the shadow. The person who refuses to own their aggression represses it, but it reappears in disguised forms: manipulation, guilt-tripping, or emotional blackmail. They appear fragile, but behind that fragility lies a demand. You must bend to me because I am wounded. History shows us this pattern in sharp relief. In medieval courts, those who could not wield swords sometimes wielded tears. Queens and courtiers used fainting spells and illnesses as tools to sway monarchs. Their weakness was their leverage. More recently, in the political arena, nations and groups often claim perpetual injury to secure resources, moral authority, or immunity from criticism. The role of the victim becomes a bargaining chip, traded for concessions. Even in personal relationships, the pattern is familiar. Consider the partner who constantly reminds you of their suffering childhood, not to seek healing, but to silence your complaints. Any attempt to hold them accountable is framed as insensitivity. How could you speak to me that way, knowing all I've been through? Here, trauma is no longer a wound seeking recovery, but a weapon preventing growth. Freud's insight into secondary gain explains this. Sometimes illness or weakness provides hidden rewards: attention, care, exemption from duty. The victim mentality thrives on these gains, and once tasted, they are difficult to surrender. But why does this work so effectively? Because humans are wired for empathy and fairness. To see another suffer tugs at our evolutionary instincts. Entire tribes survived by protecting their weakest members. To refuse aid was to risk exile. Thus, when someone presents themselves as fragile, our moral machinery activates. We feel guilty if we resist. We feel cruel if we question, and this is precisely why victimhood can function as power. Nietzsche warned that in societies obsessed with pity, the weak would learn to rule by moral leverage. Those who suffer demand compensation through morality, he wrote. What began as survival became a subtle inversion. The powerless dictate terms by exploiting the conscience of the strong. This is not to dismiss real suffering. There are true victims whose pain cries out for justice. But when victimhood becomes identity, when the wound becomes a crown, something darker unfolds. The individual no longer seeks healing, they seek control. In our time, this psychology spreads like wildfire, amplified by media and digital platforms. Victimhood narratives go viral because outrage is contagious and pity is powerful currency. To be the most injured is to hold the highest ground. And so a silent competition emerges. Who can suffer most? Who can claim deepest grievance? Who can wield pity as power most effectively? Thus, the psychology of victimhood reveals itself not as mere passivity, but as a hidden form of agency, a covert weapon. And it is only by recognizing these mechanisms, the distortions, the secondary gains, the shadow strategies, that we can begin to see through the mask of fragility. At first glance, weakness looks like the opposite of power. The fragile, the dependent, the voiceless. We imagine them as lacking influence. Yet history, psychology, and philosophy suggest the opposite. Weakness often conceals a hidden throne. Nietzsche, more than any other thinker, dissected this paradox. On the Genealogy of Morality, he introduced the concept of ressentiment, the poisoned envy of those who cannot conquer directly. Unable to triumph by strength, they reframe the game. They declare weakness a virtue and strength a vice. The powerless gain moral superiority. By this inversion, they bind the strong in chains of guilt. The lamb condemns the eagle for soaring too high, not by force of claw, but by force of moral outrage. This moral inversion has shaped entire civilizations. Consider the early Christian movement in Rome, persecuted, beaten, mocked. Yet their suffering became their banner. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, wrote Tertullian. Their weakness became their greatest weapon, haunting the conscience of the empire until emperors themselves bent the knee. Here, victimhood carried divine authority, but the same mechanism, when corrupted, becomes dangerous. Take the French Revolution. The oppressed masses, long crushed under aristocratic weight, rose with righteous anger. Yet, once they claimed power, they weaponized their former oppression as justification for terror. Yesterday's victim became today's executioner. Rousseau's ideal of noble suffering turned quickly into Robespierre's guillotine. The revolutionaries cloaked their aggression in the mantle of victimhood, and rivers of blood followed. In more recent times, this dynamic is visible in geopolitics. Nations invoke historical wounds to silence critics or to demand perpetual concessions. Leaders claim the status of eternal victims to justify authoritarian control. To disagree is to be complicit in oppression. Thus, power hides itself in weakness, and weakness becomes the most unchallengeable throne of all. On a smaller scale, the same drama plays out in households. Imagine a parent who constantly reminds their children of the sacrifices they made. After everything I've done for you, how dare you disobey? The parent casts themselves as the suffering martyr, turning gratitude into chains. What should be love becomes leverage. The weakness of sacrifice is weaponized into authority. Carl Jung's notion of the shadow helps us decode this. The person who cannot admit their desire for control represses it, only for it to return through moral theater. They are not tyrants in the open, but tyrants in disguise. They hide behind fragility because fragility is sacred. Who would dare strike at the weak? Who would dare call the victim a manipulator? The power of weakness lies precisely in its untouchability. Strength can be challenged, opposed, resisted, but weakness, once sanctified, becomes unassailable. To push back is to appear cruel. To question is to appear heartless. This is why Nietzsche warned that pity, unchecked, can rot the vitality of a culture. A society that worships weakness risks being ruled not by its strongest, but by those who have perfected the performance of fragility. And here lies the danger for each of us. When we allow our own wounds to become our leverage, we enter the same cycle. We may not carry swords or banners, but our sighs, our complaints, and our stories of suffering can bend others to our will. Power cloaked in weakness is no less power, it is simply disguised. Thus, the hidden power in weakness is both seductive and corrosive. It can liberate the oppressed, yes, but it can also enslave the conscience of those who cannot see through it. The question is no longer whether weakness holds power. The question is, who controls whom when victimhood becomes the crown? By now we can see that victimhood is not only a state of mind but also a tactic. And when wielded deliberately, it enters the realm of dark psychology, the study of how influence and manipulation work in their most shadowy forms. One of the most common tactics is guilt tripping. This is when a person evokes their suffering, whether real or exaggerated, to make another feel responsible. "If you leave me, I don't know what I'll do," whispers the partner who uses fragility to cage another. The message is clear: your freedom is cruelty, your independence is betrayal. By cloaking control in helplessness, the victimizer binds the stronger soul. Another tactic is gaslighting through fragility. Normally, gaslighting makes someone doubt their perception of reality, but in victimhood, the manipulator reframes criticism as abuse. Imagine confronting a colleague about missed deadlines only to be told, "You're bullying me." Suddenly, the conversation is no longer about accountability but about their supposed suffering. The critic becomes the aggressor, and the aggressor hides behind the mask of the victim. This tactic flourishes in politics. Leaders who position themselves as perpetual victims can silence opposition. Every critic is reframed as an oppressor. Every failure is explained as sabotage. We see this in authoritarian regimes, where leaders claim to be under siege by foreign enemies, even as they wield absolute power at home. By portraying themselves as the besieged, they secure loyalty from their people, not through strength, but through orchestrated fragility. The media amplifies this dynamic. In the age of viral outrage, whoever can claim the mantle of victimhood gains instant moral authority. Social platforms reward grievance with clicks, sympathy with shares, and outrage with momentum. A single story of injury, even when partial or manipulated, can destroy reputations overnight. The court of public opinion does not ask, "Is this true?" but rather, "Who appears most wounded?" In such a climate, the victim's voice is amplified, while the accused is silenced, regardless of the deeper truth. History offers chilling reminders of this strategy. Consider the Salem witch trials of the 17th century. A few young girls claimed victimhood, saying they were tormented by witches. Their performance of suffering unleashed hysteria. Entire communities were gripped by fear, and dozens were executed. The supposed victims became the hidden tyrants, wielding terror through their fragile testimonies. Even on the personal level, this tactic corrodes relationships. Picture a workplace where one employee constantly invokes their stress, their mental health, or their fragile state as an excuse for underperformance. Anyone who questions them risks being labeled heartless. The result: the entire team tiptoes around them. The weak one dictates the rhythm, not by excellence, but by fragility. Jung would call this the tyranny of the shadow. The aggression that dares not show itself comes wrapped in victimhood. Freud might say it is repression weaponized. Desires for power disguised as cries for pity. And Nietzsche, shaking his head, would remind us that this is the ultimate inversion, weakness ruling over strength, not by merit but by manipulation. What makes this form of power so dangerous is that it corrodes trust. When every claim of suffering could be a mask, when every plea for help could be a strategy, compassion itself begins to wither. People grow cynical, communities fracture, and the truly suffering are left unheard because the performance of suffering has cheapened its currency. This is why understanding dark psychology matters. If we cannot tell the difference between genuine pain and manipulative pain, we risk being enslaved by the performance of fragility. And if we ourselves slip into using our wounds as weapons, we risk becoming the very manipulators we fear. So the question becomes, how do we navigate between compassion for real suffering and resistance against manipulative victimhood? The answer lies not in cynicism, but in philosophy, in the hard discipline of responsibility and truth. If victimhood is the mask of hidden power, then responsibility is its counterspell. Philosophy has wrestled with this tension for centuries, the temptation to live by our wounds versus the challenge to live by our will. The Stoics understood this with piercing clarity. Marcus Aurelius, writing in the solitude of his tent, surrounded by war, reminded himself, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." For the Stoic, suffering was not a license to control others, nor an excuse to abdicate agency. It was a call to discipline. To complain was to waste energy. To weaponize weakness was to betray one's reason. Epictetus, born a slave, could have claimed perpetual victimhood. He had every reason to dwell in resentment, yet he taught instead that freedom comes from how we respond, not from what is inflicted upon us. It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. In those words lies the antidote. Suffering does not entitle us to dominate others. It challenges us to master ourselves. Nietzsche approached the same truth from a different angle. He warned of the slave morality that sanctifies weakness, turning it into virtue only to bind the strong. But his vision was not merely critical. He proposed the Übermensch, the one who takes responsibility for existence without excuses. To overcome resentment, one must will life as it is, not as a ledger of grievances. To live otherwise is to become captive to one's own wounds. Existentialists like Sartre and Camus extended this into the modern age. Sartre declared, "Man is condemned to be free. With freedom comes the unbearable weight of responsibility. We cannot hide forever behind our circumstances, our parents, or our history. To do so is to live in what he called bad faith, pretending we are merely victims of forces beyond us." Camus, staring into the absurdity of existence, reminded us that even in suffering we must choose rebellion. Not manipulation, not surrender, but a courageous yes to life. This philosophical confrontation with victimhood is not cold or dismissive. It does not deny the reality of pain. Instead, it insists that pain must not become a throne. Suffering can refine, but only if it is carried with dignity rather than brandished as leverage. To turn weakness into a crown is to remain chained to it. To take responsibility even in chains is to walk free in the mind. In practical terms, this means resisting the temptation to weaponize our wounds. It means recognizing when we use our hardships to silence others, to demand pity, or to avoid accountability. And it also means learning to respond to others' suffering with discernment. Compassion, yes, but without surrendering truth. As Seneca wrote, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." Often, the drama of victimhood is amplified by imagination, a story we tell ourselves and others to justify control. Societies too face this choice. Will they build cultures that glorify grievance, where the highest status belongs to the most injured? Or will they foster resilience, where hardship is honored not for its theatrics, but for the character it forges? The decline or strength of civilizations may hinge on this balance. A nation that sanctifies weakness risks collapse. A nation that honors responsibility finds renewal. Thus, the clash between victimhood and responsibility is not just personal, it is civilizational. And the lessons of philosophy echo across time. Suffering must be met with courage, not exploited as currency. To live otherwise is to surrender freedom for pity, agency for manipulation. The question remains, which path will we choose? To wield our pain as a weapon against others, or to shoulder it as the crucible of our own transformation? Philosophy without practice becomes ornament. Psychology without action becomes trivia. If we are to master the hidden dynamics of victimhood, we must learn not only to see it in others, but also to uproot it in ourselves. The first lesson is discernment. Compassion is noble, but compassion without clarity becomes slavery. To detect manipulative victimhood, listen for patterns. Endless complaint without movement towards solution, pain recited not for healing but for leverage, fragility performed at the very moment accountability is required. A friend who shares their struggles sincerely may seek growth, but a friend who repeats the same grievances while rejecting every path forward may be wielding victimhood as a shield. The second lesson is boundaries. When faced with someone who weaponizes their wounds, the instinct is often to overextend, to fix, to rescue, to appease. But philosophy reminds us, pity is not love, and guilt is not virtue. Marcus Aurelius urged himself to distinguish between what belongs to him and what does not. Likewise, we must learn to separate our responsibility from another's choices. Compassion does not mean surrendering your freedom. The third lesson is shadow work. Jung warned that what we deny in ourselves will rule us from the dark. If we secretly enjoy the advantages of victimhood, the attention, the lowered expectations, the moral high ground, but refuse to admit it, we become prisoners of our own shadow. The path of self-mastery requires honesty, asking whether we too sometimes use our wounds as leverage. To confront this is uncomfortable, but in facing it, we reclaim integrity. The fourth lesson is cognitive reframing. Modern psychology, especially CBT, shows us that thought patterns shape reality. If we tell ourselves we are powerless, life will confirm it. If we reframe suffering as challenge rather than sentence, we transform weakness into growth. Viktor Frankl, enduring Auschwitz, put it starkly, "Those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how." He suffered unspeakable cruelty, yet he refused to reduce himself to victimhood. He turned suffering into meaning, and meaning into strength. The fifth lesson is resilience through responsibility. Sartre's insistence that we are condemned to be free reminds us that even refusal to choose is itself a choice. To dwell perpetually in victimhood is to abdicate that freedom. To accept responsibility, however painful, is to reclaim it. We may not control what happens to us, but we can always decide how to respond. And in that decision lies the essence of mastery. These lessons extend to society as well. A culture obsessed with victimhood breeds fragility, entitlement, and perpetual conflict. A culture that honors responsibility breeds resilience, creativity, and renewal. If we wish to resist the tyranny of manipulative fragility, we must build communities that value courage over complaint, accountability over excuse, growth over grievance. In the personal sphere, the application is immediate. When someone close to you attempts to use their suffering as a chain, pause. Ask yourself, are they seeking healing or are they seeking control? Offer compassion, but with clear boundaries. When you feel the temptation to lean on your own wounds for leverage, pause again. Ask yourself, am I growing through this pain or am I feeding on it? Such questions guard the soul from the subtle corruption of victimhood. Finally, remember this. Self-mastery is not the absence of suffering, but the refusal to let suffering become one's throne. Weakness may conceal power, yes, but strength that grows from responsibility is greater still. The victim manipulates through guilt, the master transforms through example. We began with a question. What if weakness was not what it seemed? What if the trembling voice, the bowed head, and the tearful eyes concealed not helplessness, but a hidden throne of power? Now, having walked through the corridors of psychology, history, and philosophy, we see the paradox unveiled. Victimhood is not always innocent. Sometimes it is a performance. Sometimes it is a weapon. Sometimes it is the velvet glove, hiding the iron fist of control. Nietzsche warned us of this inversion. the weak ruling the strong by sanctifying their fragility. Jung warned us of the shadow, aggression hidden beneath tears. Freud warned us of secondary gain, the hidden pleasures of weakness. The Stoics warned us not to surrender our freedom to complaint, and Sartre, with his relentless insistence on responsibility, warned us that to live in bad faith, pretending we are only victims of circumstance, is to live a half-life. And yet, none of these warnings diminish the reality of suffering. There are real victims whose voices cry out for justice. But the tragedy of weaponized victimhood is that it drowns out those voices. When every injury becomes theater, when every grievance becomes currency, compassion itself is cheapened. The world grows cynical and true suffering is left unheard. The lesson for us then is double-edged. First, we must see through manipulation. We must refuse to be ruled by guilt masquerading as fragility. We must recognize when weakness is being performed as leverage. Second, we must turn inward. Have we too hidden behind our wounds? Have we too wielded our pain as a silent chain to bend others? Marcus Aurelius, speaking to himself in the solitude of power, wrote, "Don't be overheard complaining, not even to yourself." He understood that to dwell in victimhood, even in secret, corrodes the soul. True power lies not in binding others with our tears, but in mastering our own response to suffering. Look at the world around you, nations rising and falling on waves of grievance, movements fueled as much by resentment as by justice, relationships breaking under the weight of unhealed wounds, turned into weapons, weakness wielded as a crown, pity used as a scepter. This is the hidden kingdom of victimhood, and unless we see it, we remain its subjects. But there is another path. To face our pain without theatrics, to endure our wounds without weaponizing them, to transform suffering into strength, responsibility and meaning. This is the path of resilience. This is the path of self-mastery. And so I leave you with the question that lingers like a shadow at the edge of every choice. Will you use your pain as a chain, binding others, hiding in fragility, feeding on pity? Or will you use your pain as a crucible, forging resilience, claiming freedom, and rising beyond the throne of victimhood? The answer, as always, is yours to carry.